Hello and welcome to this presentation of the impact of legal cannabis to the workplace. I'm Joe Maguire, and I'm so happy to have you join us for this presentation today. I hope you'll enjoy the information. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you would like more data or details on anything that I share with you today. One of the things that I want to make sure that everyone understands right up front is that we are going to start out with the assumption that cannabis is an impairing drug. All right. There is some bit of new dialogue that's being bandied about by those who are extremely pro-cannabis, stating, well, it may or may not impair, it may or may not be a drug, or I'm drug-free, I just use cannabis. But what we actually know is it is an impairing drug. It would not be compared to alcohol if it was not. Let's not insult each other's intelligence by living in a world of make-believe. And so let's jump right into, aside from impairment and being an impairing substance, what other risks exist to the workplace, and how can we be prepared for those if and when our laws change? First of all, there is an extremely tremendous body of data on the association between the level of cannabis use and the risk of psychosis. We must be very clear that we understand this, that we get that over 571 references, 18 studies, almost 67,000 individuals who have shown that higher levels of cannabis use are associated with increased risk for psychosis in all included studies. This is extremely important for employers to recognize and understand that aside from simple accidents, injuries, that type of thing that can happen to the workplace with employee cannabis use, we're now looking at a possibility of having to be prepared for mental health issues that go over to the spectrum with increased cannabis potencies, increased use, etc. Back several years ago, when I was in the world of prevention, we considered regular cannabis use to be about monthly. And then a few years later, they said, well, we're now defining chronic use as weekly. Well, where I live in Colorado, and we've had legal cannabis now for adult or recreational use for about 8 years, it really is multiple times a day. It's not just monthly, weekly, daily. Now it's multiple times a day. When you increase potencies, which we've seen across the board with these products, and so you have much greater potency on the product, and then you increase use, you increase greater risk of having these outcomes that we're going to talk about. So keep that in the back of your mind, and I'll circle back to that in a little bit. The first episode of psychosis due to high potency cannabis use has gone up tremendously. Daily use of high potency marijuana increases psychosis risk 5 times. Weekend only use nearly triples the risk. So, we really need to be thinking about, we're not just trying to change laws, we've changed the product. It's not just a little bit of weed like you may have been used to back in your high school days. This is some stuff that has been hybridized, it's been genetically modified, and it's just not the same drug whatsoever. It also increases mood and anxiety disorders with high rates of comorbid mood and anxiety disorders among respondents with marijuana dependence. We know that adults are at risk for marijuana dependence disorder with these higher potency products. So we see, looking at workplace, you could see the extreme numbers here that go up when you have people who already have anxiety disorders, depression, mania, that type of thing. So again, another risk for employers to look out for. We also see an increased use risk of stroke amongst those who are even young men. So my graphic kind of came out weird a little bit there, but what it says is an 80% of men at an average age of 32, higher rate of stroke within 24 hours following use. That's something that is just practically unheard of when it comes to hiring healthy young men in the workplace. And then with cannabis users, you just see this this risk of stroke amongst them. So you're talking about even other greater health issues. And then you have to look at, do you have insurance coverage for those issues? Can they recover? Are they out of work? Do they need, like maybe surgery or lifetime medication? Do they then have to go on disability? And just all the things that go along with that. Cannabis use and risk of prescription opioid use disorder in the United States. You may be hearing that if you will legalize cannabis, then you will solve the opioids crisis. And the fact of the matter is, this is absolutely not true. You can see the conclusion in this study, and there are others that verify and back this up. Cannabis use appears to increase rather than decrease the risk of developing non-medical prescription opioid use and opioid use disorder. We've also seen this happen in the state of Colorado, whereas initially the opioid use dropped slightly, then it increased dramatically after that short decrease. And then we also have seen an increase in deaths related to heroin. In the state of Colorado, when employees were surveyed, 48% said they've gone to work high or stoned or under the influence of this drug in the past 30 days. It's kind of become like a badge of honor. Employees think, haha, it's funny, it's legal here, I can do what I want. And they don't consider safety first. Safety is the priority. I say all the time, drugs and safety do not mix. And whatever your employee chooses to do at home on their own time, they should do that with consideration that when they walk into the workplace, they need to be safe and prepared to work safely. So 48% is a tremendous amount of people who are willing to roll the dice and gamble and show up to work ill-prepared and maybe at risk of injuring themselves or someone else. Then, I just now mentioned what happens when an employee does what they do on their own time in their own home. And as an employer, you may think, well, that's correct. There's nothing that I can really do about that. I want you to consider a study that was done on pilots back in the 80s. And this was in New Zealand. A group of pilots, professional pilots, became proficient on a flight simulator. And they got on the flight simulator, and they could land the plane and do all of the maneuvers on the plane. And then once they had a certain amount of professional proficiency, they were given a cannabis cigarette. They all smoked this joint. It was low-grade THC, significantly compared to today's cannabis. We're assuming it was less than 10% THC comparatively. And then once they smoked the cannabis cigarette, they got back into the flight simulator and flew in time increments, right? So 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 45, an hour, etc. And they all crashed their planes. After that segment of the study, they went back to the dorms, they slept. They came back 24 hours later, said, we're feeling good, I'm fine, I don't have any more impairment. Let's see how I can fly this airplane. 24 hours after smoking one joint at low-grade THC, the pilots had difficulty in aligning with and landing on the runway, increased vertical and lateral deviation from the required flight path. Lateral deviation on approach to landing was twice the pre-marijuana test. Significant increases in distance from the center of the runway on touchdown. One pilot landed off the runway entirely. And as I mentioned, they stated in interviews that they were not aware of any type of impairment. That is something that is very, very unique to cannabis and needs to be paid attention to in the work community, because we have a tendency to take the user's word for whether or not they are under the influence. But marijuana or cannabis actually impacts the part of the brain that tells you that you've had enough and that you are impaired. So it's a real catch-22, because a lot of times people who use alcohol can say, okay, I've had enough, I shouldn't be driving, or I shouldn't try to do that task or this. But it's not typically the case with cannabis. Users will say, I'm fine, I'm safe, I'm actually better than fine, or it made me more acute or more alert or whatever. And the reality of it is that is not the case. We have to look to the science and not to those who use for the data on those outcomes. In the state of Colorado, 57% of marijuana users admit to driving within 2 hours of use. And you can see our driving data has been horrific since we have legalized this drug. We passed legal medical cannabis in 2001. And then in 2009, we allowed that to be to an unlimited amount of patients per caregiver. And then in 2012, we voted for personal or adult recreational use. Those stores opened up for the first time in 2014. So 2013, personal use was legal, but we didn't have the retail stores for another year. So we had a little bit of a dip from availability of product. And then in 2014, when those retail stores opened up, you can see that our fatalities have gone absolutely through the roof, really a way that we do not want to go when it comes to safety. 1 in 5 marijuana users in Colorado report driving after using the product. Consider this. What does that have to do with the workplace? The leading cause of death for workplace fatalities, according to the U.S. National Safety Council, is driving while impaired, driving while distracted, and driving while fatigued. You would think that, common sense would say, do not drive under the influence, but that's not quite how it pans out. As I mentioned, the users often think they're safe or safer. So this is a real problem and something that employers need to consider. The National Transportation Safety Board reported a study of truck drivers from 182 heavy truck crashes in which the driver was fatally injured. A third tested positive for illicit drugs. Marijuana and alcohol were found most frequently, right? So you can see the driving issue, it's a big issue. We also need to look at the types of industry where we're having positive drug tests and what that looks like. Employees who are full-time, ages 18 to 64, this is your prime workforce. Accommodations and food services, 20% of those employees fail their drug tests for marijuana. Arts and entertainment and recreation is high. Management, information systems and technologies, construction. These tend to be trades in which there is little to no drug testing. And I believe that is part of the reason why we see high numbers in these areas, because we do know that drug testing is a deterrent. And again, I'll circle back to that in a moment. In the meantime, we are seeing that employees who work in the cannabis industry, they are using the product on the job. They're having accidents and injuries. Many of them are coming to work under the influence. And they do, they do a job that involves a lot of manufacturing, and it is an unsafe situation. And then they have a tendency not to have benefits or coverage because their employers kind of keep them off the radar, pay them cash under the table. And so it's just a very difficult working environment that can be unsafe for those who are inside the industry. Again, I said drugs and safety don't mix. Substance use does not equal safe or safer. Substance abusers are 5 times more likely to file a workers' compensation claim in the U.S. Roughly 35% of industrial accidents and injuries that take place in the U.S. involve drugs or alcohol. Substance abusers are 33% less productive on the job, and absenteeism is significantly higher. And we see these numbers increase dramatically with employees who use marijuana. They actually have higher accident and injury rates than their counterparts who choose to use other drugs. And we've had that data for quite a long time. Any position or profession that operates machinery is at risk from someone who's under the influence. Anytime there are reflexes or judgment that are compromised, it's a problem. And note that in the U.S., substance abusers are responsible for 40% of all industrial fatalities. So if you are involved in an industry that is doing a lot of work to maintain safety and keep safety ratings high and prevent accident and injury, but you are not having an ongoing conversation about the drug culture, you are really missing the boat. So just take that into consideration. we just have, in the world of what is going on in this whole realm. Here we have a forest preserve truck driver who had a significant amount of THC or marijuana in his blood. He drove the forestry dump truck into a group of cars at a traffic stop at 76 miles per hour, and fatalities occurred. A lot of people will say if you use marijuana, it makes you drive slower, or, that which is safer. But basically, all that is that slowed reflexes, and it's not okay. We also see a lot of positives in the food industry. But as you can see by this article, we're seeing usage in transportation workers, even teachers, and even law enforcement, which is sad. Nationally, Quest Diagnostics Drug Test Index, which is one of the largest drug testing laboratories in the United States, says workforce drug positivity is at an all-time high, the highest rate in decades, finding the analysis of more than 10 million drug test results. What we are seeing is that drug use is significantly higher in 12 years after going down and down and down. It is now not only the greatest increase, but now the increase of all illicit drugs, not just legal cannabis. So we were going down, we legalized cannabis, and then cannabis positivity went up for THC or tetrahydrocannabinol, and now all illicit drug tests have gone on the skyrocket, which is, again, the wrong direction. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics, drug and alcohol-related deaths in the workplace soared in 2016 with a spike of more than 30% in a single year. And they also showed that fatal work injuries in 2016 were the highest since 2008. So you can clearly see this is not the way that we want to go. For employers, it is not enough. It is absolutely not enough just to not hire, quote, stoners or people that look like they use drugs, because people who use cannabis are in all walks of life, from your professionals to, blue collar, all the way across the board. This is something that, there's mommies who drop their kids off at school and go eat their edibles. This is all over the map. So there's really not a screening tool or method that can protect you unless you are using like a committed drug testing program. Employee drug use costs U.S. employers upwards of $7,000 a month in lost revenue. And this is as a result of lost labor, absenteeism, turnover by unreliable employees, or employees who, choose not to show up to work on time. There's a variety, especially, then it comes to accidents and injuries. Also note that there is a huge underlying subculture of people who know whether or not the job that you offer is drug friendly, and they talk online. They go to websites like Reddit and they say, does this employer drug test? Do they not? Can I get away with it? Are they friendly toward the drug user? And so that's something that you don't want to communicate out in the community in which you live by just being silent on the issue. Bottom line is, drug testing programs absolutely do work. Workers who are not in a drug testing program have substance use rates that are 50% higher than those that are. We've seen this work successfully in U.S. Department of Transportation and the military program. But these days, that drug test is not enough. Now, we are finding that all supervisors must be trained to detect and document the signs and symptoms of substance use in every employee, and to conduct tests under reasonable suspicion when they feel like there is cause that an employee may be operating under the influence. That is a great expense to an employer for that professional training. So aside from the costs I've already mentioned, this is another burden that we're seeing. They must assess the specific contemporaneous articulable observations concerning appearances, behavior, speech, and body odors of the employee. And it's something that, is showing up in court cases as employees try to sue for their right to continue working while using legal cannabis. We do not yet have an impairment test for this drug. We will not for many years to come. The drug is highly unstable. It's becoming more potent instead of being standardized at a lower potency rate. And so for people to think, well, we will just wait until there's an impairment test and then everything will be okay and it'll be just like alcohol. It doesn't work the same as alcohol. It can't be tested the same way as alcohol. So we're looking at least a decade, if not more, before we have a reliable impairment test. Employers must plan and prepare and work on prevention for incidents of workplace violence. They must actively engage in a progressive safety program. They must address mental health in the workplace as well as a drug-free workplace environment, and never ever turn a blind eye to the potential of those who could develop substance use disorders. We are in an era where employers now must consider who may be under the influence at work. And while that might sound quite silly to you, that is what the cannabis industry is supporting. They are saying you should have some employees who may be able to be under the influence at work, and then those who are safety sensitive and cannot. That is actually where we are in this era. And while you might find that ridiculous, that's the path that we're going down when we legalize cannabis. So therefore, make sure that every position description in your employee defines who is safety sensitive and who is not, and articulate why each position description should or may not operate under the influence of drugs and alcohol. And finally, I just want to say I've run through this material very quickly. I've had a lot to pour in here into a very short time. But at the end of the day, for me, this is about taking care of people and keeping them safe. And when we just kind of allow a culture to persist where drug use becomes more important than an employer's right or an employee's right to a safe and drug-free workplace, then we are not thinking of those who are vulnerable. And so I want to advocate for that. Safety should always be our greatest, highest priority. I would love to take your questions. Again, if you want to reach out to me, it is joe@joemaguire.org. And aside from that, I look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you very much.